Greetings. This is Laura Lynn Broadhurst. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. Toward the final third of MGM's The Wizard of Oz, 1939, the Cowardly Lion's mock aria, If I Were King of the Forest, offers a tour de force vehicle for burlesque comedian extraordinaire Bert Lahr. This high-parody specialty piece was custom-tailored to Lahr's persona by Oz songwriters Harold Arlen and Yip Harburg, who had already written two such specialty send-ups for Lahr's shtick on the Broadway stage. But how did the Lion's iconic number come to fruition? Based on a wealth of largely untapped archival materials, draft Oz screenplays, original music tracks, MGM records, and so forth, this paper reveals that Lahr's showcase in the completed movie was created via cumulative authorship along a figurative assembly line. Indeed, the extant sources indicate that Arlen and Harburg lost artistic control upon submission of their work, after which a chain of personnel modified their materials. Through many sequential, fairly discrete phases, the number changed significantly over time, in part because the music was adapted to suit the film's needs, but also due to the different talents of multiple creators. To demonstrate, I trace Forest through its many assembly line-like developmental stages. Genesis by Arlen and Harburg. Arrangement routining, likely by MGM musician Roger Edens. Orchestration by MGM staff orchestrator Murray Cutter. Pre-recording with the MGM Studio Orchestra. Shoot to playback, directed by Victor Fleming. Underscoring by Oz's music director, Herbert Stothert and his personnel. Previews, musical editing. Final cut released. A brief disclaimer up front, if you will. Certainly, no one can dispute that Arlen and Harburg are the sole legal authors of the brilliant songs for MGM's Oz, including Forest, naturally. In fact, soon after Arlen and Harburg submitted each song to MGM, its legal authorship was firmly attributed to them by copyright law. Significantly, though, the songs' copyrights were held by MGM's parent company, Lowe's Incorporated. Furthermore, Arlen and Harburg's Oz contracts designate that they were hired on a standard work-for-hire deal, which gave them a short-term period of 14 weeks to write all the songs for the movie. Various clauses make it abundantly clear that accepted songs would become studio property. But if we put aside the song's legal authorship and instead consider their actual authorship for use in the film, Arlen and Harburg are clearly not sole authors, but rather the principal and most crucial authors of the song's overall cumulative creation. Let's start at the end of the assembly line by reviewing Forest in Oz's final cut. Just prior to this scene, Dorothy and her three friends learn they'll get to see the wizard. The group is elated, especially the lion, who borders on euphoria. After his lead-in lines, the number unfolds in four rather distinct sections. Section 1 quickly establishes the lion's solo as an operatic spoof. A 5-bar fanfare introduction is followed by a 20-bar faux accompanied recitative. Lahr immediately pokes fun at the high-toned trappings of opera, with his grandiose gestures, sudden dainty posturing, and exaggerated vibrato. Bert Lahr's son, theater critic John Lahr, writes that his father, quote, delivered King of the Forest as if it were open season on lions as well as baritones, end quote. From the outset, Lahr and the showpiece written expressly for him are inextricably linked, arguably making Lahr a contributing author. Here's the beginning of Section 1.
In another hour, I'll be king of the forest. Long live the king. If I were king of the forest, not queen, not duke, not prince, my regal robes of the forest would be satin, and not a cotton, and not chintz. I'd command each thing, be it fish or fowl, with a woof and a woof and a royal growl.
Section 2 is 16 bars, and, as expected after a mock recitative, now lampoons an aria. Accordingly, a steady tempo kicks in, with a decisive 12/8 meter. We'll watch all of Section 2. Take note of the lion's material here, which begins, "Each rabbit would show respect to me." From this point forward, we'll call this the rabbit material.
Each rabbit would show respect to me. The chipmunks genuflect to me. Though my tail would lash, I would show compassion for every underling. Fie, old king, just
Section 3 is a 16-bar, tongue-in-cheek coronation ceremony. I'll show just the opening of this mostly instrumental segment. Section 4 consists of spoken dialogue with orchestral underscoring. For 8 bars, the lion's friends egg him on with hypothetical questions about the dangers he might face as king. This sets up the lion's 14-bar soliloquy on courage, during which he gets caught up in a series of increasingly bizarre rhetorical questions. Here in the finished film, his soliloquy is accompanied by a majestic, strict-tempo Elgarian march. Let's watch all of Section 4.
Your Majesty, if you were king, you wouldn't be afraid of anything?
Not nobody. Not no-how.
Not even a rhinoceros?
Impossibles.
How about a hippopotamus?
Why, I'd thrash him from top to bottomless.
Supposing you met an elephant?
I'd wrap him up in cellophane.
What if it were a brontosaurus?
I'd show him who was king of the forest.
How?
How? Courage. What makes a king out of a slave? Courage. What makes the flag on the mast to wave? Courage. What makes the elephant charge his tusk in the misty mist or the dusky dusk? What makes the muskrat guard his musk? Courage. What makes the sphinx the seventh wonder? Courage. What makes the dawn come up like thunder? Courage. What makes the Hottentot so hot? What puts the ape in apricot? What have they got that I ain't got?
Courage.
You could say that again. Huh? The wizard says go away!
Now we'll rewind to the beginning of the assembly line and see how Forest came to its finished form, starting with the Genesis stage. Arlen and Harburg's contracts indicate that their first official day at MGM fell about midway through Oz's pre-production phase, May 9th, 1938. But their first and only MGM piano vocal manuscript of Forest dates from late in their contractual period, August 2nd, 1938. In all likelihood, the partners submitted the number to MGM that day or shortly thereafter. At the top of the manuscript's first page, the phrase "transcribed by Sam Messenheimer" appears beneath Arlen's name. In my research, I've discussed Messenheimer's role in depth. Suffice it to say here that Messenheimer served as an amanuensis to Arlen and Harburg during their Oz assignment, often sitting beside Arlen on the piano bench and taking down the contents of each song by listening repeatedly to Arlen's playing, probably with Harburg singing along. Although Arlen possessed the expertise to notate his own compositions, he, like many of his contemporaries, regularly worked with a transcriber throughout his career. As taken down by Messenheimer, the August 2nd manuscript of Forest discloses much about Arlen and Harburg's original concept. This copy, from the USC archives, is particularly clean and clearly lays out their submission as follows. Section 1 shows the lion's 20-bar recitative, as in the final cut. However, there is no 5-bar fanfare introduction. Section 2 starts out like the finished picture, with 16 bars of the lion's aria, But here, Section 2 continues for 8 more bars. The companions sing a unison trio answer to the lion's solo, a varied repeat of his rabbit material. This 8-bar tag is rounded off with a couple of solo lines. Section 3, the coronation ceremony, is only 12 bars here, 4 bars shorter than the release print. In Section 4 here, the dialogue segment, the first 3 bars are similar to the completed movie, displaying the beginning of the comrade's hypothetical questioning of the lion, but the remainder of this section deviates vastly from the final cut. In fact, from the 4th bar on, the August 2nd manuscript reveals that Arlen originally wrote a decidedly ambiguous accompaniment as their questions continue, and especially for the lion's subsequent 14-bar soliloquy, a suspenseful series of inverted diminished sonorities tailor-made for his progressively delusional behavior. Moreover, the August 2nd score plainly shows that Arlen and Harburg never intended Forrest to end with the soliloquy. Rather, Section 4 would be followed by Section 5, a triumphant 16-bar conclusion, which pulls out all the stops to send up pretentious operatic conventions. By August 15th, Harburg and Arlen's 14-week contracts had expired, after which they had little else to do with Oz, save for a few exceptions. They soon moved on to new opportunities, while production on Oz, often fraught with difficulties, labored on for another year until its mid-August 1939 premiere. The arrangement stage of Forrest illuminates the multi-talented, yet uncredited, Roger Edens, an accompanist, arranger, and vocal coach who had previously worked at MGM with Judy Garland and Arthur Freed, Oz's fledgling associate producer, also uncredited. In a 1958 interview, Edens recalled that he had done a great deal of, quote, arranging for Oz, without specifying precisely what he meant by this loosely employed term. By arranging, Edens almost certainly meant routining, a duty he performed on numerous MGM musicals, both before and especially after Oz, as part of what would soon become MGM's celebrated Freed unit. In this coordinator-type role, Edens would have coached and rehearsed Arlen and Harburg's songs, adapting them before orchestration and pre-recording. Such adaptation encompassed tweaking the length of numbers to accommodate blocking and/or choreographic demands. To illustrate Edens' likely contributions of this sort, let's look at a different copy of the August 2nd manuscript, one preserved at the Warner Brothers corporate archive that is heavily annotated, indicating it was probably marked up after its submission, and by someone adjusting Forrest for blocking. The addition of the 5-bar introductory fanfare was instantly apparent on this copy, since it was written on a small piece of manuscript paper that had been taped to the top of page 1. The fanfare's composer might never be identified, but Edens seems a safe bet, considering blocking. After his lead-in lines, Lahr would have needed about 6 to 7 seconds of music not in Arlen and Harburg's original, enough time to walk to a nearby platform, climb the steps, and turn frontwise to begin singing. Edens was presumably also responsible for the extra 4 bars clearly needed for blocking during the coronation ceremony, marked here with a 4-bar bracketed repeat of Arlen's material. A bar count has also been added throughout this copy, likely done by a go-between figure such as Edens, and as it happens, the numbers greatly resemble the Arabic numerals within several Edens holographs I've collected. Also intriguing, Section 4, the dialogue portion with Arlen's nebulous accompaniment for the soliloquy, has been bracketed, crossed out, omitted from the bar count, and, at its beginning bar, marked Ork in Str. Perhaps it was Edens who made these markings, designating that this dialogue section didn't need to be recorded during the upcoming pre-recording sessions, but rather much later after filming, as underscoring with strings that would follow Lahr's spoken declamation. As just discussed, the vague term arranging is sometimes used synonymously with routining. Compounding the confusion in terminology, though, arranging is also frequently used interchangeably and/or conflated with orchestration, likely because, within the context of commercial music involving an orchestra, these two distinct tasks are typically carried out by the same person, an arranger-orchestrator. One of today's foremost theatrical orchestrators, Larry Blank, an expert in studio-era production practices, clarifies the dual responsibilities of this work. Quote, "The orchestrators of the Oz songs were naturally arrangers as well as orchestrators. None of them simply orchestrated by assigning notes to the instruments. As arrangers, they all created backgrounds for the singers and counter-melodies. It was part of the job. Arranger-orchestrators could include anything that came to their imagination or fingers, using quotes from existing material, classical or popular, other works from the same composers, and anything that they themselves might have created." End quote. Forrest was arranged and orchestrated by Murray Cutter, a French émigré who served as arranger-orchestrator for all the songs in Oz's final print, except the Munchkin Ensemble, and a good deal of the underscore. Regrettably, virtually all the original Oz orchestrations, including Cutter's for Forrest, were trashed in the infamous 1969 dumping of MGM's film score library, in which most of the full orchestrations and instrumental parts for classic MGM films were carelessly sent to a nearby landfill. Thankfully, numerous piano vocal manuscripts and conductor parts, that is, keyboard reductions, were spared from this debacle. From such remaining materials, much of Cutter's special input throughout Forrest can certainly still be discerned. Cutter's most extensive additions to Arlen's original music occur within the primarily instrumental coronation ceremony. In the songwriter's August 2nd manuscript, as in the completed film, the coronation segment is in E-flat major and, as seen here in the left hand, opens with a descending scale-wise bass line. Recall that in the final cut, Cutter memorably assigns this bass line to the tuba, and above it fills out Arlen's framework. Prominent in his orchestration are the ceremonial chimes, harp glissandi, ornate string and woodwind figurations, and several French horn fanfares. According to Oz's daily music reports, Forrest was pre-recorded with the MGM Studio Orchestra on October 11, 1938, all except the dialogue section. As expected, Lar was present that day, but so were the other vocal leads for their solo lines: Garland, Ray Bolger, and Buddy Ebsen, who was later replaced in the film by Jack Haley. Let's listen to some of the pre-recordings for the passages in Arlen and Harburg's concept that were later cut. First, numerous takes were attempted for the songwriter's 8-bar tag at the end of Section 2, the trio response and solo lines after Lar's rabbit material. Ebsen's voice can be detected within the ensemble here, and Bolger's on his solo line about the Queen of the May.
Just
Each rabbit would show respect to him. The chipmunks genuflect to him.
and his wife would be Queen of the May.
Nalvi Manak Namal I survey.
Also on October 11th, two versions were pre-recorded of Section 5, Arlen and Harburg's 16-bar conclusion, but each had a unique comic finish. Let's listen to the second version, featuring a cop-out ending for Lar, in which he goes for the high note but misses, and opts instead for a growl on the lower octave. Here, Lar sings the phrase "King of Kings," and Cutter adds a brief spoof of Verdi's famous Anvil chorus, complete with anvil strikes in the orchestra.
Courage is the thing of kings. With courage I'd be king of kings. The whole year round I be hailed and crowned by every living thing.
production, the actual filming or shoot, began on October 13th, just a couple days after Forrest was pre-recorded on October 11th. But the day before that, on October 10th, MGM's screenwriting department prepared a neat and tidy copy of the movie's screenplay in preparation for filming. This October 10th, 1938 screenplay is often called the, quote, final shooting script, but it was in no way final, as changes were continually made throughout the ensuing 5 months of production. Throughout these months, the various pre-recordings of the songs were played back through loudspeakers on the set, as vocalists lip-synced to the music. Oz's sole credited director, Victor Fleming, filmed all of Arlen and Harburg's numbers in the finished movie, except Over the Rainbow. It was in fact Fleming who shot Forrest toward the end of this period, between late January and early February 1939. By approximately March 15, 1939, shortly after Oz's production had wrapped, the footage taken during that 5-month period had been assembled into a lengthy 2-hour rough cut, the first print of a movie after preliminary editing. In conjunction with the March 15th rough cut, a continuity script was prepared, also dated March 15, 1939, that provided a shot-by-shot, line-by-line written transcription of what occurred on screen at this particular stage. Curiously, within the so-called final shooting script of October 10, 1938, all of Harburg's lyrics for Forrest appear, including those for the songwriter's 16-bar conclusion, as heard in the October 11th pre-recording. Yet 5 months later, by the March 15, 1939 continuity script, their conclusion is gone, strongly suggesting their final section was never shot by Fleming in late January, early February. But why would the songwriter's conclusion be eliminated? The sources provide no definitive answers, but perhaps Fleming and or other higher-ups judged the conclusion's King of Kings line at least irreverent, if not blasphemous. Whatever the reason, the decision to cut their conclusion left the number truncated in its final 4-part form, with the dialogue portion, including the soliloquy, as the last segment. But Arlen's enigmatic accompaniment for this section was likely deemed unsuitable for its newfound position at the end of the piece. Consequently, the MGM Orchestra apparently never recorded it. Fortunately, a recording of this section does survive from the era, one with Arlen's original accompaniment, lyre, and orchestra, along with brief appearances by Garland and Bolger. On June 29, 1939, shortly before the film's release, Forrest was one of several Oz songs previewed when MGM promoted the movie on a weekly NBC radio broadcast entitled Good News of 1939. The original 5-section number was performed that evening, but by extracting only the dialogue portion, we can imagine what Forrest might have sounded like in the film if it had ended with Arlen's cryptic music.
Your Majesty, if you were king, you wouldn't be afraid of anything?
Not nobody, not no-how.
Not even a rhinoceros?
Impossible. How about a hippopotamus? Why, I'd thrash him from top to bottom.
Supposing you met an elephant.
I'd wrap him up in cellophane.
What if it were a brontosaurus?
And I'd show him who was king of the forest.
How?
How? Courage. What makes a king out of a slave? Courage. What makes the flag on the mast to wave? Courage. What makes the elephant charge his tusk in the misty mist of the dusky dusk? What makes the muskrat guard his musk? Courage. What makes the Sphinx the seventh wonder? Courage. What makes dawn come up like thunder? Courage. What makes the Hottentot so hot? What put the ape in apricot? What have they got that I ain't got?
Courage.
You could say that again.
When Forrest reached post-production in spring 1939, Oz's music director, Herbert Stothert, likely with his staff, deftly replaced Arlen's original ideas with the climactic Elgar-inspired march beneath the lion's soliloquy in the final cut. Stothert's march is actually an arrangement of Arlen's music from Section 2, the now familiar Rabbit material. The beginning of Stothert's march is excerpted here from Forrest's conductor part, dated April 24, 1939. Before the last bar of the top system, I've typed in the lion's line that occurs just as the march commences. What makes a king out of a slave? This underscoring was orchestrated by Cutter and subsequently recorded by the MGM Orchestra on May 8, 1939. At least 3 sneak previews were held for Oz in mid-June, and it was likely after the third, on June 27th, that the 8-bar tag of Section 2 was cut to shave off roughly 20 seconds for the final print. This deletion was replaced with a 2-bar tag featuring trumpets, probably written by Stothard and orchestrated by Cutter, but definitely recorded by the orchestra on June 29th. By Oz's premiere in mid-August 1939, approximately 20 minutes had been deleted from the rough cut, bringing the release print down to 101 minutes. Forrest had been trimmed to 3 minutes 25 seconds, having survived a year of twists and turns that Arlen and Harburg never could have anticipated. As we've seen, in fact, Forrest represents an especially substantial degree of alteration to the partners' intentions, although in truth, all the songs in the finished picture exemplify piecemeal assembly to varying extents. Such a scenario was hardly unusual for studio-era songwriters, who often bemoaned the production line milieu in Hollywood vis-à-vis the generally more collaborative environment on contemporaneous Broadway. Like many of their colleagues, it seems, Arlen and Harburg had a love-hate relationship with Tinseltown. Granted, motion pictures offered luxurious salaries amid California sunshine, but the loss of creative control was all too common. Submitted songs could be significantly altered or dropped at any stage, depending on the powers that be, as famously exemplified by the near extraction of Over the Rainbow. However, in discussing the relationship between New York and California during the musical's, quote, golden age, roughly between the 1940s and mid-60s, to use this conference's parameters, it would be simplistic to suggest that Broadway's atmosphere was all about, quote, art and consistently collaborative, while Hollywood's was all about money and invariably cumulative, especially since, if for no other reason, some of the greatest songs of the mid-20th century were created for Hollywood films, according to the studio's modus operandi. One need look no further than the songs for The Wizard of Oz, released, interestingly enough, just prior to the asserted Golden Age time frame, but during what has often been called Hollywood's, quote, golden year. The understudied connections between the two coasts during this era, and exceptions to typical practices, call for further discussion, hopefully mitigating the lacuna of archival scholarship on both original movie musicals like Oz and stage-to-screen adaptations. In the meantime, we should hear from the two Oz songwriters themselves about Hollywood's assembly line nature. In 1959, Harburg gave a particularly unfavorable assessment. Quote, anybody who approaches the creative process on an assembly line basis must have some glandular, nervous structure for turning a thing out that is an assembly line product. That's why these people in Hollywood are able to do so many pictures a year, songs a year, whatever it is. They turn them out like gloves or fur coats, end quote. I close today with a 1961 quote from Arlen, whose sardonic comments about the West Coast scene lend further support for this paper's argument concerning Forrest's cumulative assembly. Quote, even in those days, when writing songs for such movies as The Wizard of Oz, Cabin in the Sky, and A Star is Born, when we made a lot of money, we still had no prestige. We were considered just songwriters. George Gershwin, too. He'd be invited to a party and be expected to sit down and play like some hired entertainer. George liked to play, but he resented being expected to play for the guests. You'd write as well as you could, hand it in, walk away. They'd do anything they pleased with your song. They'd change the tempo or throw it out if they felt like it. Anyhow, once a song leaves you, it thumbs its nose at you and develops a life of its own. End quote. Thank you.